The lawyer set two things on the table that afternoon: a key to a beach house worth $400,000 and a small wooden box. My sister, Diana, got the key. I got the box. Greg, her husband, actually laughed. Not loud. Just that quiet exhale through the nose that men like him use when they think they've already won. I lifted the lid. Inside was a single key and a folded piece of paper. 4 words in my father's handwriting. Lockpick. Now it's time. Across the room, an old man I didn't recognize went completely still. He knew exactly what that word meant. The rest of the room was about to find out. Before I take you back to where this really started, if you're watching this right now, drop your country and your local time in the comments. I always want to know who's out there listening. A few hours earlier, I was somewhere on I-64 East, 2 cups of gas station coffee in my system, and an overnight bag in the back seat that I'd packed in 11 minutes flat. My supervisor had given me 4 days. Bereavement leave, they call it, as if grief operates on a schedule that HR can approve. I'd left Washington before sunrise. The drive from DC to Virginia Beach is about 4 hours if you don't hit traffic, 3.5 if you drive the way I drive, which is to say, the way someone drives when they've spent enough years being told that hesitation costs more than speed. Old habit. The kind that doesn't wash out no matter how many years you spend behind a desk. I had the radio off. I needed the quiet. My father, Robert Patterson Sr., had died 11 days earlier. A stroke, they said. The second one in 3 years, and the one his body apparently decided would be the last. He was 79. He'd lived alone in the Virginia Beach house since my mother passed in 2017, and for a man who'd spent 30 years in the United States Navy. He had adapted to solitude the way sailors adapt to everything, not gracefully, but stubbornly. He made it work. He called me every Sunday, without fail. Rain, federal holiday, doesn't matter. Every Sunday at 7 in the evening, my phone rang, and for 45 minutes we talked about nothing in particular. Baseball, weather, a book he was reading. Once, for reasons I still don't fully understand, a 20-minute conversation about the migratory patterns of Canada geese. I never told him to keep it short. I never once looked at my watch. The Sunday before he died, he called at 6:50, 10 minutes early. I noticed but didn't say anything. He sounded fine. That's the word that haunts me. Fine. A little tired, maybe. We talked about a cold front moving up the coast. He asked if I was eating enough. I told him I was. He said, "Good. You need your strength, Rebecca." He almost never called me Rebecca. He'd called me Becky since the day I was born. And before that, before the Navy and the courts and the classified file numbers, he'd called me other things too. Quieter things. Words between a father and a daughter that don't translate well to anyone outside the two of them. I said, "I'm fine, Dad," he said. "I know you are." And then there was a pause. Not uncomfortable, just long. The kind of pause that in a conversation with anyone else I'd have filled immediately. With my father, I'd learned to let them breathe. He said, "I left you something." I thought he meant for Christmas. I said, "You didn't have to do that," he said. "No, I left you something. For when the time comes." I didn't understand what he meant. Or maybe I didn't want to. He died the following Wednesday morning. A neighbor found him. I've thought about that pause every single day since. Let me tell you something about Diana. My sister is 52 years old, 4 years older than me, and she has always occupied a specific kind of space in any room she walks into. The space of someone who expects to be the first person spoken to. Not because she demands it, exactly. It's subtler than that. It's the way she positions herself near the door, the way her eyes sweep a room before she says hello to anyone, cataloging, calculating. She married Greg Holt 14 years ago. He's a real estate attorney. He's very good at his job. He has a way of making ordinary conversation sound faintly like a negotiation, and I have spent 14 years eating dinner across the table from him at family holidays, and never once finishing a meal without feeling like I'd agreed to something I didn't read carefully enough. Diana and I were not enemies. That's important to say. We were something more complicated. Sisters who had grown up in the same house with different sets of expectations laid on them from birth. Diana was the eldest, which meant she was the one my parents pointed things toward. The china cabinet, the family traditions, the beach house where my grandparents had lived before my parents moved in, where we'd spent summers as children, where the dock still had the same weathered planks my grandfather had nailed down in 1971. And I was the one who left, 21 years old, the summer after my junior year of college, when I walked into a Navy recruiting office on a Tuesday afternoon and walked out with a path that took me completely sideways from everything anyone in my family had ever planned for me. My father, who had served himself 2 tours, Vietnam era, sat across from me at the kitchen table that evening and didn't say anything for a long time. Then he said, "Are you sure?" I said yes. He nodded once. That was it. That was the whole conversation. My mother cried for 3 days. Diana thought I was having some kind of crisis and suggested I see someone. Greg, who was not yet Greg my brother-in-law, but simply Greg my sister's boyfriend, said something about stability and career trajectories that I have chosen, in the interest of my own peace of mind, not to retain. What none of them ever knew, what I never told them, not in 27 years, was what I actually did for the Navy. I worked for the government. That was what I said when people asked. And technically, it was true. I just let the sentence do more work than it should have. Let it suggest mid-level, let it suggest bureaucratic, let it suggest someone who filed things and attended meetings and had a laminated badge and a parking spot. Let it settle into the shape of ordinary, because ordinary was easier than the alternative. The alternative was explaining that I was a commander in the United States Navy Judge Advocate General's Corps, that I had prosecuted war crimes, that I had walked into rooms and places most people couldn't find on a map, and done things that cost me sleep in ways I've never fully recovered from, that the people I'd brought down had lawyers and connections and long memories, that there were very good reasons I kept my name quiet. My father understood. He was the only one who did. He'd served long enough to know that the most dangerous people in any institution are not always the ones holding weapons. Sometimes they're the ones holding files. Sometimes they're the ones who know exactly where the bodies are buried. Not literally, though once, in my career, also literally. And they are patient in ways that the rest of the world doesn't have the stomach for. He used to say, "Rebecca, the ocean doesn't announce itself. It just keeps moving." At 48 years old, I had tried very hard to be the ocean, pulling off I-64 toward the coast. The salt smell hit me through the cracked window, and I felt something shift in my chest. Not grief exactly, but the particular weight of returning somewhere you associate with a person who is no longer there to meet you. I thought about the Sunday call, the pause. I left you something. I thought about the beach house, and Diana, and Greg's voice on the phone 3 days after my father died, already discussing the estate, already saying words like equitable and practical considerations in that tone he uses when he's already decided the answer and is simply waiting for everyone else to catch up. I pulled into the driveway and sat for a moment with the engine off. The dock stretched out over the water just the way it always had. My father's truck was still parked by the garage, salt rusted. Navy sticker on the rear window faded to almost nothing. I got out. I went inside. I made myself useful in the way women in my family have always made themselves useful when things are falling apart. I put the kettle on, and I waited. Diana arrived at 10:15 with 2 suitcases, not an overnight bag. 2 suitcases, full ones, the kind with the extendable handles and the little wheels that catch on every threshold. She came through the front door the way she always came through doors. First, fully, without pausing to check if the space had been cleared for her, and set them down in the hallway with the particular thud of someone who had already decided where they were sleeping. She hugged me. It was a real hug. I want to be fair about that. Her arms came around me, and she held on for a moment longer than politeness required, and I could feel that she'd been crying in the car, the way you can always tell. Something slightly swollen in the face, a careful breathed-in quality to her voice when she said my name, Beck, hey Di. We stood there in our father's hallway with his coat still hanging on the hook by the door. The old navy peacoat, dark wool, third button replaced with one that didn't quite match, and neither of us said anything for a few seconds. Then Greg came in behind her with a garment bag over one arm and his phone in his other hand, already looking at the screen. Traffic was brutal, he said, to no one in particular, to the room. I said, "There's coffee." He said, "Great," and walked into the kitchen without looking at me. The house had a specific smell that I had never been able to name exactly. Salt and wood polish and something faintly like the cedar closet upstairs where my father kept his dress whites in a garment bag, unworn for years but kept clean because that was simply how he was about certain things. The smell of a man who had been precise about the things he cared about and let everything else be what it was. I had spent the previous 2 days clearing out the refrigerator and answering calls from my father's neighbors, most of whom were retired military themselves, the kind of men and women who show up at your door with casseroles and don't stay longer than necessary because they understand that grief is private and space is a form of respect. 3 separate people told me my father had spoken about me often. One man, a retired Navy chief named Harold, shook my hand at the door and said, "He was real proud. Just so you know." I said thank you and closed the door and stood in the kitchen for a while. I didn't need to be told. I knew. But it's different, hearing it from someone else. It settles differently in the chest. The reading of the will was scheduled for 2 o'clock at the law offices of a man named Caldwell, who had been my father's attorney for 20 years and who had the kind of practiced calm that estate lawyers develop after enough years of sitting in rooms where grief and money occupy the same air. His office was in a low brick building 6 blocks from the waterfront, and by the time we arrived, there were already 2 cars in the lot that I didn't recognize. Greg held the door, and I walked through and immediately saw Earl Taggart. He was sitting in one of the chairs along the wall, a big man gone slightly small with age, the way some men do, as if the years compress them vertically while leaving the width intact. 74 years old, white-haired, broad-shouldered even now, wearing a sport coat that looked like it had been pressed that morning out of genuine respect for the occasion. His hands rested on his knees. He was looking at the floor, but when I walked in, he looked up, and something in his face shifted, recognition, but not of me. Not yet, he'd known my father. That much was clear. The way he held himself in that chair, upright, still, the particular stillness of a man who had spent years in environments where stillness was a form of readiness, told me everything about where he'd come from before I knew his name. Deanna leaned toward me and said quietly, "Do you know him?" I said, "No," which was true. We took our seats. Greg sat between Diana and the window, which I noticed because Greg always positions himself near exits and occupational habit, I've always assumed, the reflex of a man who likes to know his options. He had his phone face down on his knee, which for Greg constituted extraordinary restraint. Mr. Caldwell came in, set a folder on the desk, and offered the kind of brief condolences that are sincere but purposefully efficient. Because the kindest thing an estate attorney can do is get through the paperwork before the emotion in the room starts making decisions. He said my father had been very specific about his wishes. He said the document was straightforward. He said, and I remember this exactly, the particular cadence of it. Mr. Patterson wanted me to note that he considered this arrangement very carefully, and for a very long time. I looked at my hands. Deanna straightened in her chair. The beach house went to Diana. I had expected it. Not because my father loved her more. I want to be precise about that. Because imprecision about that particular thing would be a disservice to both of them. My father loved us differently, the way parents love different children differently, shaped by what each child needed and what each child gave back. But the beach house had always been Diana's in a way it had never been mine. She'd stayed. She'd shown up for holidays and helped with the gutters and sat with our mother in the weeks before she died. She had earned it in the ordinary accumulating way that staying earns things. I knew that. Greg did not look at me when the house was announced. He looked at the window. It was the practiced non-reaction of a man who has already won something and is being careful not to show it too soon. Deanna touched her collarbone. A small gesture, relief, I think, and also something that looked almost like guilt. Then Caldwell read the second bequest, to my daughter Rebecca Ann Patterson. 1 wooden box, contents as arranged with the note, "She'll know what to do." The box was already on the table. I hadn't noticed it. Small, dark wood, the size of a shoebox, the kind of thing you'd pass without looking twice. Caldwell slid it toward me, Greg said quietly. Almost to Diana, a box. Diana said nothing, but she didn't correct him either. I put my hands on the lid. From across the room, almost imperceptibly, Earl Taggart leaned forward 1 inch. Maybe less. The way a man leans when something is about to happen that he has been waiting a long time to see. I opened it. The inside of the box was lined with dark green felt. The kind of felt you see in old military presentation cases. The ones used for medals, commendations, folded flags. My father had sourced it deliberately. That was the first thing I understood before I understood anything else. He had not found a box and put things in it. He had built this, chosen the material, lined it himself, probably at his workbench in the garage, where he spent weekend mornings with a cup of coffee and the radio on low. He had made this for me. There were 2 things inside: a key, small flat, the kind used for a residential lockbox or a compact safe. Brass, worn slightly at the teeth, which meant it had been cut some years ago and handled regularly, the way you handle something you keep checking on. There was a piece of white athletic tape wrapped around the bow of the key, and on it, in my father's handwriting, small, slanted right, the handwriting of a man who'd spent decades filling out official forms and had made peace with legibility over style. 2 letters, an F, Norfolk. And beneath the key, folded once, a piece of plain white paper. I unfolded it. 4 words, lockpick. Now I did not react. I want to be honest about that. I did not gasp. I did not look up. I did not let anything move across my face that I hadn't chosen to put there. 27 years in the Navy will do that to you. You learn to receive information in public the way a ship receives a wave. Let it pass through you without changing your line. But inside was something I hadn't felt in years. The particular combination of grief and clarity that only comes when someone who loved you leaves behind proof that they saw you completely. He knew. He had always known. And this was his way of saying, now. From across the room, there was a sound. Not a word. Not quite. More like the involuntary catch of breath that happens when someone sees something they weren't prepared to see. I looked up. Earl Taggart was leaning forward in his chair. Just slightly. Shoulders dropped, elbows on his knees, and he was staring at the piece of paper in my hands with an expression I recognized immediately because I had seen it before, in courtrooms and in debriefs and in the faces of men who had just heard a name they'd carried for a very long time come back into the room. He recognized that word. I held his gaze for 1 second. He gave me the small nod, barely a movement, more an intention than an action. And then he sat back and looked at the floor again, and the moment closed like a door pulled gently shut. A box, Greg said again. This time he said it differently. The first time had been directed at Diana, private, dismissive, the verbal equivalent of a shrug. This time he said it to the room, with a faint upward lilt at the end, as if he were offering the observation as something reasonable people might find funny. Deanna put her hand on his arm. It was the kind of touch that means stop, the private signal language of long marriages. But it was also tentative, the touch of someone who wasn't sure she disagreed with him, just wasn't sure this was the moment. Mr. Caldwell cleared his throat and continued reading. There were smaller items, a watch, some tools, books designated to specific people, a modest savings account split evenly, everything orderly and considered, the way my father did everything. I was not fully listening. I was thinking about Norfolk NF. The tape on the key was old. The adhesive had gone slightly yellow at the edges, which meant my father had made this key and labeled it years ago. He had been holding this, waiting for the right moment to pass it along. The right moment had turned out to be his death, which meant either he had always known this was how it would go, or he had simply run out of other options. I thought about the last phone call. I left you something. For when the time comes, not Christmas. The meeting concluded in the way estate readings conclude, with handshakes and the signing of acknowledgement forms and a brief exchange near the door about next steps, timelines, paperwork. The adult machinery of grief, grinding forward because it has to. Deanna signed her forms with the focused efficiency of someone who has been thinking about this moment for a while. Not greedily, I want to be fair, but with the relief of someone who has finally arrived somewhere they'd been walking toward. Greg signed his with a pen he produced from his own jacket pocket, which I found, and I acknowledged this is uncharitable. Very Greg. I signed mine, took the box, put the lid back on, and tucked it under my arm the way you carry something you intend to keep. As we were filing out, I felt a presence at my left shoulder. Miss Patterson. I turned. Earl Taggart was standing close, not invasively, but deliberately, in the way someone stands when they want to speak quietly and privately without appearing to. Up close, he was more weathered than I'd registered from across the room. The lines in his face were the lines of someone who had spent time outdoors in difficult conditions over many decades. His eyes were gray and very steady. He said, "You don't know me. Earl Taggart. I served with your daddy, 68 to 72. He talked about you." I said, "He talked about a lot of people." Earl said, "He talked about you different." There was a pause. In the doorway ahead of us, Greg was saying something to Diana about dinner, about getting on the road before dark, about the traffic on 64. Normal sounds. The sounds of people for whom this afternoon had concluded. Earl looked at the box under my arm. He looked at me. He said, very quietly, "That word on the paper." I waited. "I know what that is," he said. "And if your daddy wrote it down and left it for you, after all these years, then whatever's in that box needs opening sooner rather than later." He reached into the breast pocket of his sport coat and produced a card. Plain white, name and number, nothing else, and held it out. I took it. From the doorway, Greg called back, "Becky, you coming?" The way he said my name, easy, proprietary, the tone of someone who has already filed me under a category and stopped wondering. Landed in that particular way things land when you've been quiet for too long. I looked at the card in my hand. I looked at Earl Taggart. I said, "I'll be in touch." We went to dinner at a seafood place 2 blocks from the waterfront that my father had liked because it was loud enough that you didn't have to work too hard at conversation. He'd understood something about family dinners that most people don't articulate, but everyone feels. That silence at a table is only comfortable between people who have already said everything important to each other, and that for everyone else, ambient noise is a mercy. Deanna ordered the crab. Greg ordered a steak, which at a seafood restaurant is a statement of some kind, though I've never been sure exactly what. I ordered whatever the waitress suggested because I wasn't hungry, and making decisions about food felt like more than I had available. The box was in my bag under the table. Greg talked about the house. Not aggressively. I want to be precise about this because the way he talked about it was in some ways more difficult than aggression would have been. He talked about it practically. Maintenance costs, property taxes, the roof, which apparently needed attention. He used the word stewardship twice, which is the kind of word that sounds responsible but functions as a claim. He was already inside the house in his mind, already measuring. Diana listened and nodded, and occasionally looked at me with an expression that was trying to be apologetic, but kept sliding into something else. Relief, maybe, or the particular discomfort of someone who has gotten what they wanted and isn't sure they deserve it. I ate 3 bites of fish and drank 2 glasses of water and said very little. At one point, Greg said, "You know, if you ever need anything, Beck, help with the transition, whatever, we're here, the transition." As if I were the one who'd lost something that needed transitioning away from. I said, "I appreciate that, Greg." He nodded and moved on to the roof again. Back at the house, Diana and Greg took the master bedroom. Of course they did. I took my old room, small one at the end of the hall, the one with the window that looked out over the dock. I'd slept in that room for 18 years and I knew every sound the house made at night, every creak settle. I sat on the bed with the box in my lap. I opened it again. The key. The paper lock pick. Now it's time NF. Norfolk. I knew what was in Norfolk. Or rather, I knew where in Norfolk. My father had a storage unit there that he'd maintained for as long as I could remember. A small rented space in a facility near the naval station. He'd mentioned it occasionally over the years in the vague way you mention something you don't want to explain. I keep some things in Norfolk, and I'd never pressed because I'd learned early that my father kept certain compartments closed for reasons that deserved respect. I had assumed it was service memorabilia, old uniforms, documents. The accumulated paper trail of a military life. Now I thought, maybe not only that. I lay back on the bed and looked at the ceiling and thought about the word on that paper for a long time, lockpick. I hadn't heard that word spoken aloud in years. It lived in a part of my life that I kept separate from Virginia Beach and dinner tables and conversations about property taxes. It belonged to a different room entirely, to JAG offices and courtrooms, and the particular fluorescent quiet of a building where serious things happen behind closed doors. I'd earned it early. My first year as a JAG prosecutor, I'd inherited a case that 3 senior attorneys had already declared a dead end, a matter involving a petty officer accused of theft, the evidence circumstantial, the witnesses uncooperative. I'd spent 6 weeks in that file. Found the one thread everyone else had missed. Pulled it, the case unraveled in a direction no one had anticipated, and by the end of it the petty officer was exonerated, and 2 senior enlisted men were facing charges instead. Someone, I never found out who, started calling me lockpick. It stuck. My father had heard it from someone years later. He'd never told me how. He just said once on a Sunday call, "I heard what they call you." And then he'd gone quiet the way he did when he was proud of something but didn't have the words for it. And we'd talked about something else, and that had been enough. Now he'd written it down and put it in a box and left it for me to find. I fell asleep with the light on and the box on the nightstand. In the morning, Earl Taggart called 6:58 a.m. I was already awake, old habit, standing at the window watching the dock in the early gray light. Coffee in hand, I answered. He said, "I figured you were up." I said, "You figured right?" There was a pause, and then he said, "Your daddy and I talked about this, what he was leaving you, not the details. He wasn't that kind of man, but he told me enough. He said when the time came, he wanted someone nearby who understood what they were looking at." Another pause. "I think he meant me," I said. "What do you know, Mr. Taggart?" he said. "Call me Earl. And what I know is that your daddy spent the last 5 years of his life collecting something very carefully, and that he did not do that without a reason, and that the reason had something to do with why you went quiet around 2019 and why he stopped sleeping right around the same time. The dock was still outside the window. The water was flat and gray and very calm. I said, "How do you know about 2019? He said, "Because Danny Rourke Sr. told me." Before he died, I closed my eyes. Danny, the name landed the way it always landed. Sudden. "Like a step you don't see on a dark staircase," Earl said. "There's more, Commander. There's something you don't know yet. It was the first time anyone had called me that in this house, in this town, in this version of my life. Commander, it moved through the room like a frequency, low, specific, the kind that vibrates in your chest before you hear it with your ears. Behind me, from down the hall, I heard Greg's voice, already on his phone, already talking about square footage and easements and the particular future he'd already built in his head. I turned away from the window. I said, "I'll come to you." "Give me an hour." I set down my coffee. I picked up the box. Earl lived 20 minutes inland, in a single-story brick house on a quiet street where most of the cars in the driveways had Navy base stickers on the windshields, and most of the front yards were maintained with the particular tidiness of peoples who had spent years in environments where disorder was not permitted, and the habit had simply stayed. He met me at the door before I knocked. He'd heard the car. Inside, the house smelled like coffee and gun oil and old paper, the smell of a man who reads serious things and took care of his equipment and didn't buy scented candles. A folded flag in a case on the mantel. Photographs on the wall, group shots, the kind taken at unit reunions and retirement ceremonies, men and women in various uniforms at various points in their lives, younger faces becoming older faces, the long visual record of a life spent in service. My father was in 3 of them. I stood in front of the wall for a moment before I sat down. He was a good man, Earl said from behind me. The best kind. The kind that doesn't need you to know it, I said. I know. We sat at his kitchen table with coffee, and he told me what he knew about Danny Rourke Sr. And I told him what I needed to. Not everything. Not the classified parts, but enough, the shape of it. What had happened in 2019 and what it had cost. And then he said, "Tell me how it started." The whole thing. I've got time, so I told him. I joined the Navy at 21 because I needed to prove something to myself that I couldn't have named clearly at the time, but understood instinctively, that I was capable of more than the life that had been assumed for me. Not that the assumed life was bad. It just wasn't mine. I tested into the JAG program after 2 years of active duty, which surprised everyone, including me. Law had never been a stated ambition. But it turned out that the thing I was good at, the thing I'd always been good at, since childhood, since sitting at the dinner table, listening to adults talk and hearing the gap between what they said and what they meant, was exactly what the law required. The ability to hold 2 versions of a story simultaneously and find where they diverged. My first posting was Norfolk, 2000. I was 25 years old, and I shared an office with a senior JAG lieutenant named Carol Hendricks, who drank terrible instant coffee and had a framed needlepoint above her desk that read, "The truth is in the paperwork." She was not wrong. I tried 4 cases in my first year. Won 3. The 4th, a fraternization matter. I lost on a technicality that I still believe was wrong and have never fully made peace with, which is perhaps why I became the kind of prosecutor I became. The kind that doesn't leave threads loose. By 2005, I was a lieutenant commander. By 2012, commander. I was assigned to cases that other people found complicated, which mostly meant cases where the complications were political, where the person on the wrong side of the charge had connections, had rank, had friends in rooms where decisions got made quietly over drinks. I tried not to think about those rooms. I thought about the facts. The facts were always there. Patient, waiting the case I am most proud of. And I say this not as a boast, but as a statement of what it cost, which is how I measure these things. Was a 2014 matter involving a young Marine Lance Corporal named Terrence Webb. Webb had been charged with assault. The alleged victim was a senior sergeant. The evidence against Webb, on paper, looked straightforward. 2 witnesses, a medical report, a chain of command that was unanimous in its account. What the chain of command did not know was that I had found a 3rd witness. A Navy corpsman who had been present and who had been told explicitly by a superior not to volunteer what he'd seen. I spent 3 weeks finding that corpsman. I spent another 2 weeks earning enough of his trust that he agreed to speak. What he told me changed the shape of the case entirely. Webb was acquitted. The sergeant was charged. The superior who had instructed the corpsman to stay quiet was separated from service. The corpsman shook my hand outside the courtroom and said, "I didn't think anyone was actually going to do something." I said, "Someone usually does. It just takes longer than it should." I meant it as comfort. Looking back, I think it was also a warning I was giving myself without knowing it. 2 years after that, I got a call from a petty officer first class named Danny Rourke. He had a story, the kind of story that, the moment you hear it, you understand why the person telling it has been carrying it alone for as long as they have. Because it involves names and ranks that make the air in the room change when you say them out loud. Danny was 38 years old. He'd been on a joint operation in 2015, a counterterrorism matter in a location I won't name, and he had witnessed something that he believed constituted a war crime. Not a gray area, not a matter of interpretation under pressure. A deliberate act, ordered by a specific person, carried out on unarmed individuals, witnessed by multiple people who had subsequently been dispersed to different postings within 60 days. The specific person was the son of a 2-star general. Danny had reported it through proper channels, 3 times. The first time, he was told the matter was being reviewed. The second time, he was told the matter had been reviewed and closed. The third time, he was told, not in writing, that further reports on this matter would be considered conduct prejudicial to good order. He came to me in 2018 because he had run out of other doors. I spent a year building the case. It was the most careful year of my professional life. Slow, methodical, every step documented, every source protected to the fullest extent I could manage. By late 2019, I had enough. I was ready to move. And then, in the space of 3 weeks, everything came apart. My supervising officer was reassigned. My case files were reviewed by a legal team I had not been introduced to. I was informed that the matter was being transferred to another office for handling. I was not told which office. I was told this was routine. It was not routine. Danny knew what was happening. I called him when I understood, 3 days before the transfer was finalized, and I told him what I could within the limits of what I was allowed to say, which was not very much. And I told him to be careful, and I told him I was not done. He said, "I know, Commander," he said. It's okay, the way he said it, quietly, with the particular exhaustion of someone who has been fighting a long time and has simply run out of the energy to be surprised. I should have heard it differently. I didn't. 6 weeks later, Danny Rourke was gone. I found out on a Tuesday morning from a 2-line email. I sat in my car in the parking structure for 45 minutes before I went back inside. I never told my father exactly what happened. But he knew. He always knew when something had broken in me, the way he'd known things about me since I was small. Not through words, but through the particular frequency of my silences, the ones that meant I was carrying something I hadn't figured out how to put down. The ocean doesn't announce itself, he used to say. I had tried to be the ocean, but even the ocean, if you push hard enough in the wrong places, eventually shows you the rocks underneath. Earl listened to all of it without interrupting. That is rarer than it sounds. Most people, when you tell them something difficult, cannot resist the impulse to fill the spaces, to offer context, to reframe, to insert themselves into the narrative in some small way that makes them feel useful. Earl Taggart sat across from me at that kitchen table, with his hands wrapped around his coffee mug and his eyes steady on mine, and he simply listened. The way men listen who have spent years in situations where the wrong word at the wrong moment costs something irreplaceable. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, then he said, "Danny Sr. talked about you." I waited. After it happened, after the boy died, he called me. We'd known each other a long time. He was a wreck, the way fathers are wrecks when something happens to their children that they couldn't stop. He said he didn't blame you. I want you to hear that clearly. He said you were the only person in that whole machinery who had actually tried. I looked at the table. He said he'd written it down, Earl continued. Everything he knew. Everything Danny Jr. had told him. Everything his son had documented on his own before he died. Danny Sr. was not a man who trusted institutions at that point. Can't blame him, but he trusted your father. They'd met through me, years before any of this. Your daddy was the person Danny Sr. chose to hold it. I looked up. Earl nodded once. Robert had it for 4 years. Kept it in Norfolk, the key. The small brass key with NF written on a strip of athletic tape, worn at the teeth from being handled regularly, kept in a green felt box that my father had built and lined himself and held onto until he ran out of time to hold it any longer. 4 years. My father had been carrying this for 4 years. Coming home to this house, watching the doc, calling me every Sunday, talking about geese and cold fronts, and whether I was eating enough. And all the while, 45 minutes up the road in a storage unit in Norfolk was the thing that could finish what I had started and been stopped from finishing. He had waited because he understood timing. He had spent 30 years in the Navy learning that acting before the moment is right costs more than waiting, that patience is not passivity, that the ocean does not throw itself at the rocks. It simply keeps moving until the rocks are no longer where they were. He had waited, and then he had died before he could tell me himself, so he had done the next best thing. He had left me the key. I drove to Norfolk alone. The storage facility was near the naval station on a flat commercial street where the buildings were all the same. Low, beige, metal-doored, the kind of place that asks no questions about what you keep inside as long as the monthly payment clears. My father had rented the unit since 2009, I found out later. 15 years of uninterrupted rent, paid by automatic transfer from an account I hadn't known existed. The key fit the lock on the third unit from the end of a ground-level row. I stood at the door for a moment before I opened it. Inside was not what I had imagined. My father had been organized. Of course he had been organized. He was Robert Patterson Sr., United States Navy, 30 years of service, a man who ironed his civilian shirts and kept his files in labeled folders and replaced burnt-out bulbs the same day they went. But the degree of organization in that unit stopped me at the threshold for a full 10 seconds before I walked in. Metal shelving along both walls. Labeled boxes, dates, not contents. His personal service records in a fireproof case. Photographs. His father's medals in a hinged display box. The accumulated paper archaeology of a long and careful life. And on the center shelf, at eye level, sitting alone with nothing beside it, a manila envelope, sealed, my name written on the front in my father's hand. Rebecca Ann Patterson, not Becky, not Beck. The full name, the one he used when he meant something completely, underneath my name in smaller letters. For when the time is right. I believe that is now. I picked it up. It was heavy, not enormously, but with the specific weight of documents, of pages, of things that have been collected and organized and sealed against the possibility of loss. I sat down on the concrete floor with my back against the shelving unit and I opened it. There were 3 sections, held together with binder clips. The first was Danny Rourke Sr.'s account. Handwritten, 12 pages, dated March 2020, 4 months before he died. His handwriting was cramped and careful, the handwriting of a man who had not written much by hand in years, but was making himself do it this way because he did not trust a computer, did not trust a phone, did not trust anything that could be accessed remotely by people with the right clearances and the wrong intentions. He had written everything: the operation, the date, the location, the order given and by whom, the names of 6 other witnesses who has been present, what had happened to each of those witnesses in the 60 days after, the reassignments, the deployments, the administrative actions, the 1 medical discharge, the 1 early retirement. He had written his son's name at the top of the first page. This is for Danny. And for whoever is brave enough to finish what he started. The second section was a collection of documents, official records that Danny Jr. had gathered and passed to his father before he died. Transfer orders, administrative action records, a redacted after-action report with 3 specific passages circled in red ink, passages that, read against the timeline Danny Sr. had constructed, told a story that the redactions were supposed to prevent anyone from reading. I read it carefully. Then I read it again. The redactions were not as complete as whoever had ordered them had believed. I had spent 27 years learning to read around redactions, to find the shape of what was missing from the shape of what remained. It was, in a sense, exactly what the call sign had always meant. The third section was a single photograph printed on plain paper. It showed 4 people standing outside a building I recognized, a specific building at a specific installation, the kind of location that appears in no public records. The photograph was dated. One of the 4 people in it was the son of the 2-star general. Another was a man I had not seen before, whose face I did not recognize. The third was a JAG officer, the one who had informed me in 2019 that my case was being transferred to another office for handling. The fourth was the 2-star general himself. The photograph was dated 6 days before my case was transferred. I sat on that concrete floor for a long time. Outside, a military transport passed on the road, the low diesel rumble of something large moving at steady speed, unhurried, carrying whatever it carried toward wherever it was going. My father had known. He had known, and he had kept this safe, and he had waited, and now he was gone, and the work he had done in his quiet and patient way was sitting in my hands on the floor of a storage unit in Norfolk, and it was the most complete act of love I had ever been given by anyone in my life. I folded the photograph carefully. I put everything back in the envelope. I stood up. I called Earl. I said, "There's something else you need to know. And then I need you to tell me about Danny Rourke's son." Danny Rourke Jr. was 24 years old, and he drove a 10-year-old pickup truck with a cracked windshield and a pine tree air freshener hanging from the mirror that had long since stopped smelling like anything. Earl had called him the night before. By the time I got back from Norfolk and pulled into Earl's driveway, Danny was already there, sitting on the front steps with his elbows on his knees and a paper cup of gas station coffee going cold in his hands, looking at the ground, the way young men look at the ground when they are carrying something they've been carrying for a long time, and are not entirely sure the person they're about to hand it to will be strong enough to hold it. He was built like his father, Earl had told me. I didn't know what his father had looked like, but I understood what Earl meant. There was something in Danny Jr.'s posture that spoke of physical capability held deliberately in check, the particular stillness of someone who had learned early that their size could frighten people they didn't want to frighten. He stood up when he saw me. He said, "Commander Patterson," the way he said it. Not tentatively, not with the slight upward inflection of a question, but as a statement, as a fact he had known for some time and was now simply delivering, told me that Earl had prepared him, or that his father had. I said, "Danny." He nodded, looked at me for a moment. Then he said, "He talked about you, my dad. He said you were the one who actually believed him." I said, "I did believe him. I still do." Something shifted in his face. Not relief exactly, too young and too guarded for pure relief, but something adjacent to it. The particular easing of a person who has been braced for disappointment and has not, this time, received it. We went inside. Danny Jr. had his father's original testimony, not a copy. The handwritten, witnessed, notarized by a civilian notary in a strip mall in Virginia Beach on a Thursday afternoon in January 2020, 2 months before Danny Sr.'s cancer diagnosis, 7 months before he died. His father had given it to him sealed, with instructions not to open it until he found someone he trusted completely, and the criteria his father had given him for that trust were specific enough that Danny Jr. had carried the sealed envelope for 4 years without finding anyone who met them. Until Earl called. Until Earl said the name lockpick. He put the envelope on Earl's kitchen table and pushed it toward me. I opened it slowly. The notarized testimony was 16 pages. It covered everything the handwritten account in the Norfolk envelope covered, but in the formal structured language of a legal declaration. Dates, times, locations designated by coordinate rather than name, the precise military language of a man who had been trained to report accurately and was applying that training one final time to the most important thing he had ever needed to report. At the bottom of the last page, above the notary seal, Danny Rourke Sr. had written one additional line in his own hand, outside the formal body of the declaration. "My son deserves to know his father told the truth. I hope someone makes sure of that." I read that line twice. I put the pages down on the table and looked at the window for a moment, at the ordinary rectangle of morning sky above Earl's backyard fence, and I made myself breathe evenly the way I had learned to breathe in rooms where I could not afford to let anything show. Then I picked the pages back up and kept reading. What I had in my possession, between the Norfolk envelope and Danny Jr.'s notarized testimony, was the following: a first-hand account of a war crime corroborated by documentary evidence, with 6 named witnesses whose subsequent reassignments followed a pattern consistent with deliberate dispersal to prevent collaboration. Documented proof that a JAG officer had met privately with the subject of an ongoing investigation, and the subject's commanding officer saw 6 days before that investigation was transferred and effectively buried. A redacted after-action report whose unredacted portions, read in context, confirmed the timeline and the location of the incident. And a photograph. What I did not have was jurisdiction. My case had been transferred in 2019. I was no longer the assigned attorney. Reintroducing this material through official JAG channels meant going back into the same system that had swallowed it once already, with the same risk that it would be swallowed again, faster this time by people who now knew what to look for. I needed a different door. Greg found the Norfolk property on the 3rd day. I don't know exactly how. Greg was a real estate attorney with access to county records and a professional habit of knowing what people owned that I had underestimated because I had been thinking about other things. He called me on a Tuesday evening while I was in my old bedroom reviewing documents, and he said, in that carefully pleasant voice he used when he was making a move he expected to go unchallenged, I didn't realize your father had a second property, a storage unit and some kind of small garage space in Norfolk. That would technically be part of the estate, I said. It's a storage unit, Greg, he said. Still an asset. We should probably have it assessed. For equity, I said. I'll look into it, he said. I could have someone from my office handle it. Save you the trouble. The offer was framed as generosity. It was not generosity. It was a hand reaching toward something he had no reason to want unless he had some idea of what it contained, and the only way he could have any idea of what it contained was if someone had told him, which meant someone had been paying attention to what I had been doing in ways I hadn't accounted for. I said, I appreciate that, Greg. I'll handle it myself. I hung up and sat very still for a moment. Then I called a man named Colonel David Merritt. David Merritt was the chief legal officer of Naval Station Norfolk. 3 years from retirement, a man I had worked alongside in 2011 on a procurement fraud case that had taken 14 months and ended with 2 convictions and 1 resignation. He was not a man who owed me anything. He was also not a man who, in my experience, had ever confused procedure with justice when the two were in conflict. I said, David, I need 45 minutes. Off the record, to start. I have something you need to see. There was a pause. He said, how serious? I said, a photograph, a notarized declaration, and a redacted report that isn't as redacted as someone believed. Another pause. Longer, he said, come in tomorrow. 7 side entrance. That night, I heard Greg on the phone in the downstairs hallway, speaking in the low, deliberate voice he used when he didn't want to be overheard, but hadn't bothered to go outside. I couldn't make out words. Just tone. The tone of someone managing a situation, making arrangements, the verbal texture of a man who believed he was several moves ahead of everyone else in the house. I lay in my father's house in my childhood room and looked at the ceiling and thought about the photograph in the manila envelope and the JAG officer's face in it, and the 6 days between that photograph and the transfer of my case. I thought about Danny Sr. writing his son's name at the top of 12 handwritten pages. I thought about my father calling me 10 minutes early on the last Sunday of his life, and the pause, and the way he'd said, I know you are, not reassuring me, I understood now, but confirming something to himself, making sure he still believed it before he let go. I thought about the call sign, not the origin of it, not the story I usually told when people asked, the courtroom version, clean and professional, the other version, the one that was true. They called me lockpick because I had a reputation for finding the door that everyone else had walked past. My father had left me a key. There was only one thing left to do with it. Colonel David Merritt was already at his desk when I arrived at 7 a.m. The side entrance to the legal building at Naval Station Norfolk opened into a corridor that smelled like industrial cleaner and old coffee, and the particular institutional neutrality of a place where serious things happened without announcement. David was in his office at the end of the hall, door open, jacket on, which told me he had treated this meeting as official before I'd even sat down. He was 58 years old, gray at the temples, with the kind of face that had started out angular and been worn smooth by years of absorbing difficult information without flinching. We shook hands. He gestured to the chair across from his desk. I sat. I put the manila envelope on the desk between us. I said, "Before I open this, I need you to understand something. I am not here to ask for a favor. I am not here because we have history. I am here because what's in this envelope meets the threshold and deserves to be treated as such, and because I believe you are one of a small number of people in this building who will look at it and respond to what it actually is, rather than what it's inconvenient for it to be." He looked at me for a moment. He said, "Open the envelope, Becky." I opened it. He read for 22 minutes without speaking. I know because I watched the clock on his wall. Old habit. The habit of a prosecutor who has spent years in rooms where time matters and silence is information. He read the handwritten account first, then the notarized declaration, then the redacted report. He looked at the photograph for a long time. Then he set everything down and looked at the window. He said, "The JAG officer in this photograph?" I said, "Yes," he said. "He's still active." I said, "I know." He was quiet for another moment. Then he picked up the photograph again, held it at a slight angle, the way you hold something when you're looking at it for the second time and checking what you thought you saw the first time against what's actually there. He set it down. He said, "I'm going to make 2 calls. You are going to sit in the waiting area and not contact anyone until I come back. Is that understood?" I said. "Understood," he said. "This is going to move fast once it moves." I said, "It's been 5 years. Fast is fine." It moved fast. By noon, a Naval Criminal Investigative Service agent had been brought into the room. By 2 in the afternoon, a second colonel from the Judge Advocate General's office in Washington, a woman I had never met named Colonel Frances Add, who had flown in from D.C. on a morning shuttle, was sitting across from me in a conference room, reviewing the same documents with the focused efficiency of someone who had been waiting for exactly this kind of material without knowing she was waiting for it. She asked me precise questions. I gave her precise answers. She did not express surprise or sympathy or any of the emotional responses that would have made me trust her less. She simply worked. That was the right response. That was the only response I wanted. At 4:15, she said, "We're going to need the notary witness testimony authenticated. We're going to need the 6 named witnesses located and contacted. And we're going to need a formal statement from Danny Rourke, Jr." I said, "He's available. I can have him here tomorrow," she said. "Good," she paused. "Commander Patterson, what you've assembled here, combined with what NCIS has in a parallel file they were prevented from activating in 2020. This is sufficient. I want you to understand that," I said. "What parallel file?" she said. "There were people who tried in 2020. They were stopped. The file was sealed administratively. It's been sitting." She looked at me steadily. "It was waiting for something that couldn't be dismissed. It was waiting for this." I thought about Danny Sr. on the floor of a strip mall notary office in January 2020, 2 months before his diagnosis, carefully writing down everything he knew in the formal, structured language of a legal declaration. He hadn't known about the parallel file. He'd just kept going anyway. The formal proceeding convened 12 days later. It was not a court-martial. Not yet. Not at this stage. It was a formal inquiry, which is the institutional mechanism that precedes a court-martial the way a long inhale precedes a shout. But it had the weight of what it was, and the people in that room knew it. And the people who had spent 5 years preventing this moment from arriving also knew it. which was why 3 of them had lawyers present. Judge Miriam Souza came on the second day. She was 68 years old, a retired federal judge who had been my father's friend since the early 90s. They had met at a veterans legal aid event and had stayed in touch in the quiet, consistent way that serious people stay in touch, through occasional letters and less occasional phone calls, and the kind of long friendship that doesn't require frequent tending. She had known about Danny Sr.'s testimony. My father had told her, not the details, but enough. She had been waiting in her own way for the same thing everyone had been waiting for. She testified about the administrative suppression mechanism, about the specific procedural pathway that had been used in 2020 to seal the NCIS file. She had seen it used before, twice, in her years on the bench, and she named both previous instances and the outcomes and the pattern they established. Her testimony lasted 3 hours. When she finished, the room was very quiet. Then Danny Jr. walked in. He was in a clean shirt and dark pants. Not a uniform. He hadn't served, but he dressed with the deliberate care of someone honoring an occasion. He sat down at the table and he put his hands flat in front of him, and he read his father's declaration aloud in a steady voice that only broke once. At the line, "My son deserves to know," his father told the truth, and then he steadied himself and finished. When he was done, he folded the pages and he looked up. He looked at me. I nodded. He nodded back. The 2-star general had retired in 2021. Retirement does not confer immunity. His son had been promoted twice since the original incident, which, when that fact entered the record, produced an audible reaction in the room from 2 of the NCIS investigators that they made no effort to suppress. The JAG officer in the photograph, the one who had informed me in 2019 that my case was being transferred, was placed on administrative hold the same afternoon. Miriam Souza testified. Greg did not know any of this was happening. He had sent 2 more emails about the Norfolk property, increasingly formal in tone, increasingly specific about estate law, that I had read and not answered. On the 4th day of the inquiry, a paralegal from the JAG office made a routine inquiry into the legal status of certain estate assets connected to the case. The inquiry touched Greg's firm. I did not arrange that. I want to be clear about that. I did not arrange it, and I did not anticipate it. It happened because the case had its own gravity now, and gravity does not ask permission before it pulls things in. Deanna called me that evening. She said, "Greg got a call from someone at the Navy today." I said, "I heard." There was a long silence. She said, "Becky, what exactly do you do?" I looked out the window of the hotel room I'd been staying in. A view of the naval station, the flat gray water beyond it, a carrier in the distance sitting perfectly still on the horizon. I said, "I work for the government, Dee." She didn't say anything. I said, "I'll explain everything, I promise." "When it's done," she said, quietly, not angry, not accusing, just tired and slightly undone. "I think I was very stupid," I said. "You didn't know," she said. "I should have asked. I thought about that for a moment." I said, "Yeah, maybe." It was the most honest conversation we'd had in 20 years. The inquiry ran for 19 days in total. I will not walk through all of it. The procedural machinery of a military legal proceeding is not something that narrates cleanly, and the parts that matter most are rarely the parts that make the most noise. What I will tell you is that by the end of those 19 days, the record contained enough to refer the matter for court-martial proceedings, that the referral was made, and that the 2-star general and his son and the JAG officer in the photograph were each represented by separate civilian attorneys, which is always the sign that the people paying for those attorneys understand the situation they are actually in. I was not the lead attorney on the proceedings that followed. That was Colonel Odd's work, and she was extraordinary at it, methodical and relentless in the particular way of someone who had chosen this profession because they believed in what it was supposed to do, and had not yet been ground down into cynicism by the distance between the ideal and the practice. I gave my testimony, provided my documentation, And then I step back the way you step back from something you have built and handed to people who can carry it further than you can carry it alone. That is harder than it sounds. I am not, by nature or by training, good at stepping back. Greg's situation resolved itself in the way these things resolve when a person has built their professional reputation on knowing exactly where the lines are and then operating precisely at their edge. He had not done anything technically illegal in relation to the estate. What he had done was contact someone connected to the original investigation. A contact he'd made through a real estate transaction 2 years earlier, a contact he'd called when he realized the Norfolk property might contain something valuable. And that contact, when NCIS began pulling threads, had become a thread worth pulling. He was not charged with anything. He lost 2 clients and a referral network that had taken him a decade to build. Deanna told me this on a Tuesday evening, 3 weeks after the inquiry closed. Sitting across from me at a table outside a restaurant, 2 blocks from the waterfront where the same ordinary evening sounds of a coastal town went on around us. Tables full of people eating dinner, the clink of glasses, the faint smell of salt on the air, as if the world had not, in the past several weeks, shifted significantly on its axis. She said, "He didn't know what was in the storage unit. I want you to know that. He was trying to protect the estate. That's what he told me." I said, "I believe that." I did believe it, actually. Greg was many things, but I had never thought him deliberately malicious, just constitutionally unable to resist the pull of advantage. The habit of a man who had spent so long operating in the narrow space between legal and ethical that he had stopped noticing the distance between them. Deanna wrapped both hands around her wine glass and looked at the water. She said, "Why didn't you ever just tell us?" It was the same question she had asked on the phone weeks earlier. This time, sitting across from me, it sounded different, less accusatory, more genuinely wanting to understand. The question of a woman who had spent a month rearranging her understanding of her sister and was still in the middle of the rearrangement. I thought about how to answer it honestly. I said, "Because it was never about being believed, Diana. It was about doing the job." She looked at me for a moment. She said, "Dad knew." I said, "Dad always knew." She was quiet. Then she said, "He was proud of you. He told me once. Just once. A couple of years ago. We were on the dock and I was going on about something, I don't even remember what, and he just said out of nowhere, 'Your sister does important work, Di. Real important.'" I didn't ask what he meant because I think I didn't want to know how much I'd missed. I looked at the water over her shoulder. I said, "You didn't miss it. It just wasn't yours to see," she said. "That's a kind thing to say," I said. "It's a true thing." We sat there for a while without talking, which was its own kind of progress. The 2 of us, after decades of managed distance and careful conversations, and the particular exhaustion of sisters who love each other and have never quite figured out how. Just sitting in the same silence without either of us trying to fill it. After a while, Diana said, "The beach house." I said, "Keep it, Di." She looked at me. "Becky, he left it to you because it was right. You stayed. You showed up. You earned it the way you earn things. By being present." I paused. I was present somewhere else. That was my choice. I don't resent it and I don't want it corrected. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Would you come?" "In August. Like we used to." I thought about the dock. The same weathered planks our grandfather had nailed down in 1971. The flat gray water in the early morning and the sound of the house settling at night and the particular quality of light on the coast that I had grown up inside and spent my adult life not allowing myself to miss too openly. I said, "Yeah, I'll come in August." Danny Rourke Jr. came to see me the week before I drove back to Washington. He brought coffee, 2 cups from the same gas station as the day we'd met at Earl's house, which I thought was either coincidence or a statement of some kind. We sat on the front steps of my father's house, which Diana had agreed to hold empty until the estate was fully settled, and drank our coffee and looked at the dock. He said, "I want to do what he did. My dad. The work he did, what you do." I've been looking at the JAG program. I looked at him. He was 24 years old, with a cracked windshield pickup truck and his father's build, and the particular quality of stillness that I associated, by now, with people who had been through something that required them to grow up faster than the world usually permits. I said, "It's not easy work," he said. "I know." I said, "It costs things. Things you don't know you're spending until they're gone," he said. "I know that too," I believed him. I said, "The program is competitive. You'll need to do well on the LSAT. You'll need recommendations." I paused. "I know people." He looked at me. I said, "Your father did important work, Danny. He did it alone and he did it scared and he didn't stop. That matters." He looked at the doc. He said, "He used to say the only thing worse than a system that fails, you is giving up on fixing it." I thought about my father, about Earl. About 19 days in a conference room in Norfolk, and a photograph and a small brass key worn at the teeth from being handled regularly for 4 years by a man who had never stopped believing his daughter would know what to do with it. I said, "He was right." We drank our coffee. The dock held its shape against the water the way it always had. Old and salt-worn, and exactly where it had always been. A year is a long time and not a long time. It depends on what you're measuring it against. Against the 5 years that Danny Rourke Sr.'s testimony sat in a sealed envelope in a storage unit in Norfolk, 1 year is nothing. A single rotation, a breath, the amount of time it takes a bureaucratic process to move from referral to resolution when the people running it are serious about the outcome. Against the 27 years I spent building a career that most of my family couldn't see, 1 year is also nothing, a footnote, a settling. But against the weight of what that year contained, I will tell you that 1 year can feel, at its end, like arriving somewhere you have been walking toward for longer than you knew you were walking. The court-martial proceedings concluded in the spring. I will not give you the names. That is not my place. The record is public for those who know where to look, and the details are the property of the process and the people who survived long enough to see it through. What I will tell you is that the findings were what the evidence required them to be, and that Colonel Frances Ade tried the case with the same methodical relentlessness she had brought to every stage of the proceeding, and that when it was over she called me and said, simply, "It held." I said, "Good," she said. "You built it to hold," I said. "My father built it to hold. I just found the door." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "However you want to characterize it, Commander. It held." The JAG officer in the photograph received a dishonorable discharge and a sentence that I will not specify here except to say that it was proportionate. The general's son received the same. The general himself, retired, insulated by decades of careful relationship building, was not court-martialed, but he was stripped of a significant portion of his retirement benefits through a separate administrative process that Colonel Add had initiated in parallel, the kind of move that takes patience and precision and the willingness to work 2 tracks at once. He had retired believing he was untouchable. He found out otherwise. Danny Rourke Jr. started law school in September. He got into a good program on his own. I had written him a recommendation, but the LSAT score was his, the application was his, the personal statement was his. Earl told me later that Danny had written the personal statement about his father, about what his father had done and why he had done it, and what it had cost, and what it had ultimately meant. Earl said it was the best thing he'd read in years, and Earl was not a man who deployed that kind of assessment loosely. I framed Danny Sr.'s notarized declaration, the original, not a copy, and had it delivered to Danny Jr.'s apartment before he started his first semester. I included a note that said only, "He did the right thing. Now you get to build on it." I didn't sign it. He knew who it was from. Earls sent me a photograph in November. He had found it in a box of his own, the accumulated physical archive of a long friendship, photographs and letters, and the paper evidence of a life spent in company with people he had chosen carefully and kept close. The photograph was of 2 men in navy dress whites, standing on a dock that I recognized immediately. The dock behind my father's house, the same weathered planks, The same angle of afternoon light off the water. My father was on the left. He was 40-something in the photograph, which put it somewhere in the late 80s. His hair still dark, his posture the exact upright stillness I associated with him at every age. Earl was on the right. They were both looking at the camera, not smiling exactly, but with the relaxed faces of men who are exactly where they want to be. My father had his hand on the dock railing, the same railing I had touched 1,000 times. I put the photograph on the mantel in my apartment in Washington, next to the folded flag from his service and the piece of paper, framed now, on which he had written 4 words in his careful slanted hand. Lockpick? Now it's time. In August, I drove back to Virginia Beach. Diana had spent the spring painting the inside of the beach house. Not dramatically. Just the quiet maintenance of someone taking possession of something properly, acknowledging that it was theirs now, and they intended to care for it. The dock had new boards in 2 places where the old ones had finally given out. She had kept the rest. Greg was there. We were not close, and we would not become close. That was simply the truth of it, and I had made a private decision some years earlier to stop spending energy on relationships that the other party had not chosen to invest in. But he shook my hand when I arrived, and he said, "Good to see you, Becky." And there was something in his voice, not contrition exactly, but a muted quality, a reduced confidence. The voice of a man who has been made aware of his own dimensions, that told me he understood more than he would ever say out loud. That was enough. Deanna and I sat on the dock the first evening, after dinner, after Greg had gone inside to answer emails and the light had gone low and gold over the water, the way it does on the coast in August. Long and warm and slightly melancholy, the way summer evenings are melancholy. Carrying in them the knowledge of their own ending, she asked me about the call sign, not defensively, just curious. The way a person is curious about a word that has moved through their life for weeks without ever being fully explained, she said. Lockpick. Why that? I thought about the 23-year-old version of myself in a JAG office in Norfolk, pulling at a thread everyone else had declared a dead end. I thought about Danny Rourke Sr. in a strip mall notary office, writing his son's name at the top of 12 pages. I thought about a small brass key worn smooth at the teeth from being handled by a man who had never stopped believing his daughter would know what to do with it. I said, they gave it to me early, because I had a reputation for finding the door that everyone else had walked past. Cases that looked sealed. Situations that looked closed. I had a way of finding the thing that opened them. Diana looked at the water. I said, Dad understood it better than I ever explained it to him. That's why he wrote it down. That's why he left me the key. I paused. It was never just a call sign. It was a receipt. Proof of what something cost. Proof of what it was worth. Diana was quiet for a while. Then she said, he knew you'd finish it. I said, he knew I wouldn't stop. The water moved the way water moves, without announcement, without urgency, in the direction it had always been moving. Patient and steady and completely indifferent to whether anyone was watching. My father used to say, the ocean doesn't announce itself. It just keeps moving. I have spent my whole life trying to be the ocean. I think, finally, I understand why. Not because the ocean is powerful, not because it is relentless, but because it moves in service of something larger than itself, without requiring recognition, without stopping to ask whether the shore has noticed it arriving. You do the work because the work is right. You keep the key until the time comes. And when the time comes, you open the door. If this story moved you, if you've ever been the one in the room that people looked past, if you've ever done the quiet work that no one saw, tell me. Leave me a comment. Tell me where you're watching from and what this meant to you. Those comments are the reason I keep telling these stories, and I read every single one.